This has probably been the most demanding build I've done all year. It has taken me a hilarious amount of time to make it run properly without losing oodles of CPU performance for no good reason. But first let me back up a bit. Over the last 2 weeks or so I managed to acquire quite a few nice components that I thought would play well together. And it's a respectable bunch at that, featuring a Core i7-9700 8-core CPU, a GeForce 1070 Founders Edition GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, water cooling, well, you get the picture, up and mid-range. The CPU and motherboard came as a package out of a pre-build, wink wink nudge nudge where the issue lies. That Asus Prime H310 motherboard, except for sporting PCIe, well, non-E ports, plus a COM and parallel straight out of 2005, despite being manufactured in 2019, is completely unremarkable. That is until you start rummaging through the BIOS and notice that it has Asus enhancements. It's not overclocking per se, it's just removing power limits for the CPU, and that has a dramatic effect on performance. If your motherboard supports this, you really should use it, otherwise you're leaving a very considerable amount of performance on the table. We shall return to this topic in a bit, but for now indulge me while I rattle off the rest of the system specs. The board did not come with its included I/O shield, so I had to make do with a universal one, and even though I bugged it a bit, it still looks miles better than without it. The case is a very nice affair from Corsair with a tempered glass side window for which I paid too much, not realizing that the fasteners are missing. No biggie, as I had suitable replacements and it's virtually unmarked, but next time I will be more careful. Pre-install the fans this time because nobody wants to see fans being screwed on camera, unless you're a celebrity, that is. Let's see, what else? A 256GB NVMe brand new SSD, a 500GB freebie HDD, and a very decent Corsair VS550 will round out this particular build. RAM is also from Corsair in the form of a 16GB kit running at 2666 Mbps without any added voltage or timing tuning, which is the maximum this platform can support. But let's not forget the water cooler. In the form of Cooler Master Liquid 120, there's no issues keeping up with the i7's heat output. While I continue to assemble this PC on fast forward, I can tell you a bit about what made this build so frustrating. After discovering the PPL limit remover in BIOS, I did what any responsible PC builder would do and removed it for a lot of extra performance. Point, I would like to say thank you Asus for providing it and move along, but I have this pesky habit of stress testing every build I make to make sure it's all good and there are no hidden gremlins. And this time there be gremlins. The keen-eyed among you might have noticed that those VRM heatsinks do not look quite stock, and that is because they are an air quotes aftermarket edition. See, with the power limits removed and the CPU chugging down about 140 watts of power instead of its usual 65 or so, the voltage regulator modules were doing their best to self-immolate at around 120C before they started reeling in the CPU by throttling its speed. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I have a dedicated video on the subject, but it took me a week to fix the issue to my satisfaction. 5-phase VRM in my opinion should have factory heatsinks on it regardless, as it would greatly improve its lifespan. The PCB already has the hole for mounting the heatsink, so it's something deleted to save on costs. Long story short, I ended up buying some generic heatsinks from Amazon and cutting them to size, gluing them down with thermal glue and putting a bar over the top for added security. This does not 100% solve the overheating issue with the limits completely removed. It does allow, in conjunction with the Tune 140mm fan, to raise the long-term power limit from 65 watts to 110 watts without adverse effects or longevity concerns. Fan tuning philosophy usually stops at set everything to silent, but here I had to spend about 4 hours tuning this rig to an inch of its life to make sure that the fans are silent and the VRM fan kicks in when it is required. Quick BIOS profile save later and everything is working perfectly, not leaving any precious performance untapped, especially for gaming. And to top it all off, it looks great, but don't take my word for it, I am sure you can judge for yourself, and I shall see you in the benchmarking section. Off, we start as per usual with Heaven, and although I don't remember when it is the last time I had a 1070, I did recently benchmark both 1080s and 1060s, so I know that it should fit somewhere in between, hopefully towards the 1080 end of the spectrum. Little disclaimer here, I forgot I mucked about a bit with the card and it had an unintentional overclock about plus 30 MHz on the core. The difference is so small because of the relatively minor OC that I did not feel the need to redo any testing that I had completed with it present, but I do need to disclose it. Oh yeah, and the results. Well, it's definitely closer to 1080, being less than 20 FPS slower, and not a faster 1060, as the difference between them is a massive 54 FPS, so we are off to a great start already. And the bonus fun fact here, this result matches an RTX 2060. Stay tuned if you want to see that build. Superposition, this card again impresses, posting a 70 FPS average, which lands it much closer to the 1080's 83 FPS than the 1060's 48 FPS. There really isn't much more to say here really. Superposition is a much newer benchmark compared to Heaven, and it's exponentially more demanding, so this is a very respectable result indeed. Here we have Rocket League running with over 300 FPS with everything else turned up as far as it will go. This is more of a CPU test these days, and as you can see the i7 passes with flying colors, and in a weird twist it means that the 9th gen i7 paired with the 1070 narrowly beats 8th gen i5 paired with the 1080. Fortnite, with everything set to epic at 1080p, we get 74 FPS on average while goofing around in the Party Royale mode. This will vary a bit depending on the circumstance, but since Fortnite is so CPU bound, we are sure to have a great experience regardless. Dropping down to medium with epic draw distance and no resolution scale increases the average FPS a massive margin, giving us about 176 FPS in the same location. No matter your playstyle, this configuration will deliver a solid experience even on high refresh rate monitors. Horizon Zero Dawn is not a particularly well optimized game, but it is not horrible either, so getting 67 FPS with everything maxed out at 1080p means that this machine will have absolutely no trouble delivering a great gaming experience in this title. Oh, and the benchmark run is quite a bit more demanding than regular gameplay, so expect even better performance in your playthrough. Closer to 80 FPS actually. In Death Stranding I went straight for the maximum settings, as there is no need to test anything else. This game is very well optimized and runs with decent FPS on a very wide range of hardware. I've turned motion blur off though, but not for improved performance, just because it is stupid. Recommendation would be to just turn VSync on and lock it to 60 FPS, but if you have a variable refresh rate monitor, having higher FPS around 90 or so on average doesn't really hurt either. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we get 54 FPS with decent 1% and 0.1% lows. This is primarily a sightseeing and exploration game, so not having a locked 60 FPS or above really does not hurt the experience at all. A mild overclock of plus 100 MHz on the core and plus 200 in memory, the average figure pushes up to 56 FPS, only 2 FPS higher, but hey, it's in striking distance of its bigger brother, the 1080, that posted 60 FPS under the exact same conditions. Cyberpunk has an unexpectedly linear progression, giving us over 60 FPS at low, 54 FPS at medium, 43 FPS at high and 35 FPS and ultra high, sans RTX that is. If you don't touch the resolution scale slider, this game looks phenomenal at any settings in my opinion. I will probably still play it on medium on this machine to have a good balance between graphical fidelity and FPS, but the simple fact that you have such a broad choice in a very demanding title is in itself a very good thing. And I would be remiss if I did not mention here that the CPU did a brilliant job supporting the performance. For instance, this machine was only 2 FPS slower than a similar build with an i5-8400 and a 1080 under very similar test conditions that I posted a video on a couple of days ago. I've said it before and I'll say it again, in Days Gone the very high preset is a tad bit useless, but if you are getting over 60 FPS regardless of what you do, even entering a new area, an act that is famous for tanking FPS, I mean, why not push it all the way up? Of course, if you are gaming on a high refresh rate monitor, especially if you have FreeSync or even FreeSync, then it would be worth going for high, constant over 90 FPS. But in the end, however you decide to play this title, you are guaranteed a good experience. Am I playing Diablo 2 Resurrected? Well, because I wanted to. Is the stress test for the system? No, not really, as the underlying game engine is a bit old at this point. Older than some in the audience of this video actually, but it has been polished up with a graphical sheen that does take some considerable GPU power to run. Generally, you can expect about 94 FPS on average, but depending on how much there is on screen, it can fluctuate by about 10%. But not once during my online play did it feel it stutter. Oh, and that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next one.